There are some formulas for this chapter, but not as many or as difficult as the ones from chapter 18. The first set of formulas pertain to contribution margin. All contribution margin are the sales minus variable costs, kind of similar to gross profit. Contribution margin is not the net income because remember there are other costs such as fixed costs. The more sales will increase, the more variable costs will also increase. These numbers will always vary. Once you subtract the fixed costs from this number, then you will have net income. Next is the contribution margin per unit, which is the same formula but on a per unit basis. You will use the selling price per unit instead of total sales, minus the variable cost per unit instead of all the variable costs. Lastly is the contribution margin ratio. This will turn the information you just calculated into a percent. You can find this number in two ways, using either the contribution margin or contribution margin per unit numbers. You can either divide contribution margin by the total sales, or you can divide contribution margin per unit by the selling price per unit. You would get the same answer using either formula. Based on the information given to you in a problem, you would pick the formula that would be easier to calculate. For instance, if you already have all the amounts on a per unit basis, then you would just go ahead and use the second formula. You always want the contribution margin ratio to be a higher number. The higher number, it means that the more money that you're making off of each product. The higher number, the better. Let's practice these formulas. This is your classwork problem number 3. Zhao Company has fixed costs of $340,000. Its single product sells for $200 per unit, and variable costs are $132 per unit. The company expects sales of 8,000 units and has a desired income of $170,000. Compute. For part A, the contribution margin per unit. And just letting you know, there is definitely a lot of information here you don't need at the moment, but we will be using the same information for other formulas as well. Remember, you should be following along. And like I said before, you should really pause right now and try to work out this problem first before we go over it together. Let's calculate the contribution margin per unit. Remember, this formula is the selling price per unit minus the variable costs per unit. What is the selling price per unit? It is $200 per unit. What is the variable cost per unit? It is $132 per unit. $200 minus $132 is $68. This is our contribution margin per unit. Part B would like us to find the contribution margin ratio. Remember, there are two formulas. One is contribution margin divided by sales, and the other is contribution margin per unit divided by the selling price per unit. Which one should we use here? We should use the second one, contribution margin per unit divided by selling price per unit, because we already have this information. Regardless, we would get the same answer, but this one would be faster for us to calculate. We know the contribution margin per unit from part A is $68. Divide this by the selling price per unit, which we already determined is $200. $68 divided by $200 equals 0.34. We would like to turn this into a percent, so it would be 34%.